Hello, parents. We are joined here again today with Nikema Missouri and Deanne Lewis,
Hello.
your school counselors. We wanted to come in, and originally, this podcast, the focus was going to be trauma and really just focusing in on coming around from the time of the pandemic and some of the other social challenges and occurrences that we as a school community and in our larger neighborhood community have been impacted by. For example, we're on the second anniversary of George Floyd, and there we've gone through definitely several political challenges. But now we thought it more prudent, more timely to really address some of our more recent tragedies in the news, specifically this week's school shooting in Texas.
Yeah. As we talk today, we're going to be going through and highlighting some things, from the letter that was sent out. There were several resources on there about talking points, what's developmentally appropriate, how to, have these conversations, these really, really tough conversations with your children, if at all, and all of that. So we're going to go through that in this podcast today. So one of the main things that we pointed out was the reassurance that our children are safe, because as we know, in times like these, it is scary for us as adults, right? With all of our coping mechanisms and all of our information and the people that we may have in our corners to talk to. So if our children now get wind of it, right,
Definitely.
especially our older children, who chances are they have gotten wind of it or will, it can be very scary. So the number one thing I think that we've gathered is to just reassure your child that they are safe, and that they're here, they're there with you, talking about the ways in which they're safe. And the article highlighted that as well. Just giving them tangible examples of how they're safe, but just reinstilling that and reassuring them of that fact is really, really important.
Definitely. For our little ones, and sometimes even for, I actually like this activity. I did this in grief work with little people, but the parents would always come back and say how much they enjoyed this exercise as well. And you take a little jar, right, and you can call it counting your blessings. You can call it sometimes kids would count the days until they were seeing a loved one that they had to move away from. Sometimes they were counting the days until they would go to visit maybe even a graveside of someone they had lost. But you just kind of get two jars, you get your child's kind of favorite manipulative. It could be marbles, it could be the fuzzy balls, buttons, something like that. And then you can just transfer and you can do this daily, right? You can do this again for that time. But to do it for, hey, let's kind of visually hold and model, and it gives people, and like I said, because it really, it's an object experience for parents as well. It helps you just kind of walk through in a tangible and concrete way the reality of such, because sometimes things, just like you're saying, Deanne, the ways that we're safe, right? So you can talk about your home, you can talk about your community, you might talk about their favorite sport that they like to attend. Those things can be very conceptual, right, particularly in the moment. Yeah. But if I can just kind of take that button and hold it and say, this button is my home, this button is my pet, this button is my parents, right? It really just adds that little point of concrete experience that anchors and grounds some of this internal anxiety that we can feel. And just that practice of gratitude, right? If we kind of stick it there, let's kind of stick it there in just terms of counting your blessing, using that exercise to count your blessing or your points of safety, as Deanne said. You can, you can really then experience that every day instead of just allowing the anxious feelings and anxious emotions to loom.
Definitely. And I like that the word that you used, the anchoring effect of it. And I know that I've had conversation, even with other adults and, you know, interesting conversations, hard conversations, and even for adults, having something tangible is very helpful because sometimes we just don't know what to do with the feelings that we're feeling as well. And, whether that's having conversation or whether that's dealing with our own, emotional state, having something tangible, right? So, when I work with kids also, we'll give them a stress ball. That's something that we often talk about and often, recommend for a child to have. In my office with little kids, I have a lot of physical things that they can work with, right? Squishies and poppets and all those things. And I even find myself using some of them at times to talk because it is definitely very grounding and very steadying.
Yeah. I think here too is a good place to echo the trauma and resilience service team from the Child Mind Institute, where they note that one place that we might keep ourselves from going, but what's actually cognitively true is that children often feel safer than we feel. Our worry and the anxious level or emotional experience that we have internally, often we're feeling like it's for the child. Like some part of this, yes, is us. We're grieving, we're mourning, we're looking across the land, particularly here with this issue. And we're kind of playing that out, right? Oh my gosh, I can just imagine if it were me. I can just imagine if that was my child, that was my school, that was my community. And we really lean into that otherness. Just imagining playing out the experience of the other and then putting ourselves in it. So a lot of that worry, we then, imagine it for our child as well. But children, right, in their developmental stage, really most of it all the way, just like we talked about last time, all the way up to early adolescence. Early adolescence, we start to get that little shift where children can other a little bit more. They can take that other perspective a little bit more. But there is a sort of developmental selfishness that kind of shields them from incidences like this. And it may sound shocking, but it's nice because it kind of gives them a little incubator that they can continue to trust the world, trust their environment, trust their experience to continue to be safe because of that kind of egocentrism. And, well, it's not something directly impacting me, right, personally. And again, not that they're thinking this consciously, just something that they're experiencing, but it does allow them to have that buffer against a lot of the stress and anxiety that parents may be feeling. And that starts to shift a little bit when they can take that other perspective a little bit more.
Absolutely. And as we were talking about that, that ability, right, to think about someone else, that ability to think about someone else's perspective. It is definitely a learned skill, right? And so children, not having that theory of mind, as we would call it, right? When they're younger, maybe second, kindergarten, first grade, all of that. Then it kind of leaves us as parents like, do I talk to them about this? Do I not? I remember.
And again, Deanne, theory of mind is that capacity to take your perspective and offer it to another or take on the perspective of another.
Not exactly. But when we think about that theory of mind, and I'm glad that we paused here. So it's not giving someone else our perspective, but it's really that ability to see someone else's perspective separately from yours. So saying, this is my perspective, this is their perspective, and kind of hold both to be true. And smaller kids, they don't have that yet. That's not a muscle that they've learned to flex until we do it. And I, in light of everything that's been going on, I read an article that came out I think yesterday or something, and it was from ABC.
Mhm.
And, some people have given the advice to, make sure that you do initiate these conversations. But I think we want to be wary, well, maybe I shouldn't say wary,
Mhm.
thoughtful,
Mhm.
mindful
Mhm.
about, the level of conversation we're having with our children.
Mhm. Mhm.
Again, if any at all, depending on their age, right? And I
Mhm.
think that even in a lot of different, or with a lot of different issues, right?
Mhm.
Parents sometimes get nervous, like, well, do I talk about this? Because I don't want to give
Right.
them any ideas, right? I don't want to put
Right.
this in their head. And I think in a situation like this, again, of course, think about the child's age, like their
Mhm.
chronological age, think about their
That's right.
maturity and their
That's right.
maturation,
And it's like you
all that
said, right,
counts.
that it's a learned skill,
Yeah,
right? So that perspective taking is learned, and so thus it's taught,
right.
right, on some level. So parents starting the conversation appropriately,
Yeah,
right? So you are taking that moment to kind of watch your child, check in with them. And I think that idea of more kind of holding the developmental selfishness and also understanding that they don't fully take in the other's perspective as of yet.
yeah,
And so I may feel a bit more anxious than they may feel.
right,
It really assists more of the parent and giving a buffer to our own anxiety,
right.
right, about it. And so just kind of holding that, I'm probably because my brain, my mind, my perspective is more complicated.
Right,
So I'm probably more anxious than my child is really experiencing. And so let me approach the conversation kind of tamping that down,
right.
right? And it's like more taking your anxiety and making it progressive
Yeah,
instead of paralyzing you in that way. Not that it would be debilitating, but it might cause you to pause
yeah,
and say, oh, I'm not sure if I should, it's a big thing. But it's more like take the anxious energy and direct it. Okay, we can have a what can feel like normative,
yeah.
very conversational talk about what's going on.
Definitely. And I think as you were speaking, I was thinking about just
Mhm.
an idea that we talk about, right? With younger kids, they fall and they hurt themselves, right? And it's like, oh, no, no, no. You don't want to get too excited. You don't want to startle them. You don't want to scare them
That's right.
because they look to you
That's right.
as
They
their
pick up
guide.
your anxiety.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And especially for the younger ones, we're talking about
Yeah.
their you are their ruler. You are their
Yeah.
measure of how to
Yeah.
respond to certain things. Now, of course, when we get to the older kids, now we start to see, right, they have started to develop that theory of mind. They do think about, okay, well, this is how I feel, and maybe this is how someone else feels.
That's
So
right.
for children that age, right,
Mhm.
even when we go to talk with them, right, and as
Mhm.
they're older, as they are, pre-adolescent and adolescents,
Mhm.
we do want to have these conversations with
Yeah,
them
and more in-depth
because
conversations as well.
absolutely, absolutely more in depth and very factual though.
Mhm.
I would say that
Mhm.
because a lot of our as people and even as children, a lot of the fear is
Mhm.
coming from the unknown, is coming
Mhm.
from the gray, right? We as people,
Mhm.
we want black and white. We want to know, is this, happening or is it not? Is it something I need to be worried about or is it not? Is it black or is it white? And for those gray areas where it's like, this is happening, but it's not happening here. And it could happen,
Right.
but it's probably not going to happen, right? So all of those conversations, I think, need to be had with our children that have a little bit more understanding. But just providing concrete, short, specific information
Yeah.
for again those pre-adolescent, those kids that are still young, not quite teenagers yet, but
Yeah.
they need
Yeah.
something. I would give them pieces of direct information without
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
know elaborating too much or
Right,
too
kind of some
emotion.
concepts, some ideas.
Yeah,
And I think that's where parents can even use a lot of the media exposure to
hmm,
their benefit,
yeah,
because part of the issue that we think about when we want to start to move into the idea of, we've been talking about anxiety and kind of this anxious response that we do have to issues like this
hmm,
and occurrences like this. And, here I want to highlight that that's normal,
yeah,
right? So it's not, and I think on both accounts, right? Like even using the terms like anxious or developmental selfishness, sometimes they can be jarring. But I just want to highlight and drive down that these things are normal and they're very useful.
Yeah.
They're very helpful. Just remember last podcast, we talked about Erickson's stages of development. And if children didn't kind of have this sense of really being able to focus in, they wouldn't really be able to establish their worldview as
Absolutely.
safe
Yep.
and as a world that I can trust
Yeah.
and a world that I want to move in, take risks in, and a world that will meet my needs.
Absolutely.
Right. And so it's actually very useful and very positive that they kind of work in this realm. And so also likewise, when we move into the media coverage, we kind of always go to, oh my God, too much all day, all night,
Yeah.
right in the child's hands, at their fingertips. And to that point, right, Deanne, that's another reason that you probably do want to really be encouraged to start the conversation.
Absolutely.
Because if they didn't see it on a device
Yeah.
that they have in their hand, their friends certainly did.
Right.
And so they've already heard about it. And so the conversation coming from us as parents definitely shapes it,
Yeah.
right? And we can craft that emotional space, that emotional wave that we want our children to that emotional gear rather that we want our children to kind of shift in and sit in. And I like the idea of walking through the media
Yeah.
with your children,
Right.
right? Kind of sitting, determining how much are we going to watch, how much are we going to expose ourselves, being a reflection of that, right? How much do I sit on my device? How much do I sit in front of my screen and take it in? And then pulling back and processing it,
Yeah.
right? Using some of those opportunities one-on-one or in a family style setting, take a little bit in, pause and process.
Yeah.
Take some in, pause and process. Because that becomes the biggest thing. We end up gorging
Yes.
on the media. And there's so much, not only is there a plethora of it, but then it's all this variety. And I mean, some of it really does draw you in. It's so
Absolutely.
intriguing.
Absolutely. And
and interesting.
I love the way that you just explained everything. And that is why, and again, that's another point that we highlighted right from the article, is to make time or take time to have the discussion. Because again, I like to go back to, examples and even things in my own life, with a younger child, right? Where I would not have this conversation. She would have no idea what I'm talking about.
Correct.
But even when it comes to things like screen time, right? That's something that parents were always talking about. We're always concerned about no screen time, 2 hours screen time, all the screen time, whatever. I need to cook, all these things.
Yes.
But it's different, right? So if you just leave your child, again, I'm thinking a young child, a toddler, to their own devices with the screen, then that's not good. But if you're watching it together and you're now bringing up conversation and you're asking questions and you're prompting them, now it provides them space to have this conversation that they wouldn't have had on their own. Right. So I think similarly, or I'm kind of like drawing that line of connection there that, okay, so we do have our middle schoolers, right, that are probably seeing all this, eating all this up. But when we make that time, because of the relationship that we've built, right, from the first couple of podcasts, because we have that rapport with our children and we're making this time intentionally to have these conversations, now it goes from being the overwhelm to being, okay, so this is information. Let me clarify this for you.
That's right.
Let me take the time to explain to you that different sources, sometimes they have different motives, and it's good to have multiple sources if you're going to get information. And let's go back over that information, because some things are clickbait and some things are, all of these things. But I think that it just, again, it solidifies, it reinforces our relationship with our children when we make that time to talk. It helps them to think broadly, and not so narrow about the world, and just even their ability to consume information, but then synthesize it.
That's
right.
Right.
Think about it, not just take it in, but let's critique it.
That's right.
Together. All of that is good. And so while it can be a lot, I agree with you. It can be used to their advantage and ours.
Yeah. And that really highlights keeping the discussions developmentally appropriate.
Yeah.
And I think one of the Um, this brings up a story from me when I was one of probably any of them, but giving birth to one of my children, and I remember going through. They wheel you in when you're still like half conscious. It's day 2 or 3, but you're still half conscious. Like, what is the world? What is happening? I have a human that was inside me. And so they have you take this class before you leave the hospital, or at least they used to. And, they kind of go over the basics of baby care. And I remember going to the nurse once and I said, this class is super helpful. It's really good. And this was probably my third baby, right? So I probably have like a preschooler and then like a toddler at home. And I'm like, why don't you talk about, toddler issues and potty training and doing a sleep schedule? And, I was bringing up all these things, nothing related to infancy. And so the nurse looks at me and just so sweetly and so patiently, she said, now, what does a new mother, what, what does a new mother need to know about those things just yet? She'll get there.
Yeah.
She'll get there. We want to help moms right where they are.
That's good.
And right, it was so good. It was so good. And I didn't get it at the time, so I was still frustrated. And that's because
that's human, right?
I was in a different place.
Of course.
Right. I'm about to bring another one home, and right. But her point again, and bringing it back here, was to really meeting our children right where they are.
Love that.
And having the conversation there, and using that mindfulness there that we as parents can have in terms of how much do I really need to give them?
Right.
We just want to kind of watch our own way so that we're not caught up in that media sensationalism of just having as much and just as much information as we possibly could have.
Right.
Just enough, just those right pieces for right now, for where they are.
That's good.
Yeah.
I love that. That's so good. And I think that when we step back and do that, I think that is calming for us as well. And oftentimes, not all the time, right? When we have these conversations with children, I feel like it's very enlightening for us as adults, right? So, so many examples here, but I'm thinking of not my own child, but in working with a child. And, she was presenting this behavior. And I was very honest with the child. And I said, so this is what I'm seeing. From my perspective, it looks like this. And the child was, they were a little bit upset, a little sad. And I said, well, you look like you want to cry, but you don't want to cry. So I was like, what's happening? And then they opened up in that moment for the first time in months, right? About, well, this is happening. And I just really needed this, right? This girl wanted to be by the water. Well, you can't be by the water. It's not your turn to be by the water. Why aren't you following instructions and all of these things? And then she told me, well, I've never gotten to do that. Like, she just likes being by the water. This could be a source of peace for her. But if we had not paused and had that conversation, I wouldn't have known that. Right. And I was honest with her, and I didn't apologize. And I guess I could have, but in that moment I said, I'm so glad that you told me that. Right. And I said, well, now that we've had this conversation, I can give her something different. Whereas I'm thinking, okay, maybe she needs a boundary. Maybe we need to have this conversation about, following instructions. Are you mad about something? Are you pushing back? Are you rebelling? Right? All of this. And that wasn't it. Right. The girl liked the water. Right. Right. And so that was, it was interesting. But because we stopped and we had the conversation, I was able to shift what I was planning to give to her, right? That I thought that she needed the structure and all of that. It's not what she needed. Yes. She needed somebody to listen to her and to understand her. And she walked away with a smile on her face. I said, you're not in trouble. Like, now I understand. And now my heart feels different too. Definitely. Yeah, so, definitely. And I think that gives parents such a good framework in a spot that gets very murky. And that's the delineation between these developmental frameworks that we're talking about that communicate what children need versus looking at the individual unique child and letting them have a voice, giving them the honor to communicate
their needs and their space,
Right.
right? And kind of where they are. And I think that is where we kind of hit bumps in the road.
Yeah.
I'm a very highlighting that idea we talked about a little bit at the beginning, that um, our kids pick up on our emotional space, and I really lean into that. Parents provide and craft the emotional atmosphere in a
Absolutely.
home, right? And
Absolutely.
just really um, thinking about it in that way, that atmosphere. How do we vibe? What's the energy of our home emotionally? And I think a large part of where you create that and you're trying to intentionally make that is in that space of that conversation, the developmental framework,
Yeah.
the individual child,
Absolutely.
and those two spaces communicating, right? And just going after it with your best.
Yeah.
That's not like part and parcel. There's not going to be like, oh, specifically this, that, 1, 2,
It would
3.
be great.
It would be so good, right? That's that book that every parent's looking for. Like, this is it.
Right.
It's all the parent books like put into the one golden book somewhere that we're all looking for.
Mhm.
But it's just kind of, I think, that thought there, having the developmental framework, have a conversation with what you as the parent are seeing, the child communicate as their unique needs,
Yeah.
the needs that we do want to lean into and honor their voice, their communication of their needs and desires, but
Yeah.
also allowing that developmental framework to inform how we react, how we respond
Absolutely. And
to
I
those
think
needs.
a big part of being able to do all of that, right? And everything that we talked about is getting ourselves in the right framework
Yes.
and mind frame and mindset as well, because we're human. We feel, right? We emote.
Yes.
We do all the things and have all
Teach
the
us
things.
about that self-care, Counselor Deanne. Yes.
So, right. So then of course it's like, well, if I'm busy being stressed out, how can I now create a space of peace for my child? How can I now create a sense of calm for my family? And we, again, in the letter, there is discussion about how do we take care of ourselves in the midst of taking care of everybody else, which I think is a very age-old question, and it will continue to need reminders. But one of the things is just not to neglect yourself, and it's easier said than done. I think that pausing and being reflective, self-reflection is huge, because if we just keep going in our regular routine and we don't stop and pause for, am I okay? Am I sleeping? Am I eating? When's the last time I drank water? All these things, then we don't have room and we don't have space to show up as our best selves and to create the atmosphere that we want for our families, because we don't have it to give.
Yeah. I like something I was reading the other day, some notes from a seminar, and they had a header of like, rest all day, right? And so it was this idea of, don't wait for that 8 hour, or really for most of us, probably 5 or 6 hour chunk of sleep at night. Don't wait for the big vacation to the beautiful place. Don't wait for that 1 hour massage where you have to schedule it in and get to the place. But how can you bring those experiences into 2-minute chunks, 3-minute chunks, momentary chunks throughout your day?
Yeah.
And I think that's really significant. And for us to really figure out, like when you say don't neglect yourself, really, what does that mean?
Right.
For some people, it is bath bombs and fuzzy socks. Yeah, right.
I raised my hand. I like those
but yeah. But if you're, and to our other parts of the population, that's like fuzzy socks. I'm more over there. It might be that you're really leaning into handwork. Getting into the shop, gardening, crocheting or knitting, beading, or something even simpler as a hand massage, running your hands under cool water. I think a lot of those, it's what's really cool about the neurological perspective of our field now is all of these little brain hacks
Yeah.
that are coming out of it.
Absolutely.
Right. And so, how can I really pause
Mhm.
the panic stress,
Mhm.
the debilitating stress response?
Yeah.
And then, how can I rechannel it, or how can I channel it and redirect it to something progressive and useful and helpful? Right. How can I put it into action?
Absolutely.
And one resource that I think that we put up, it did talk to families about that. So it was things like, can you get together as parents and have some process sessions for yourself? Kids are kind of put away, or they're off someplace playing and, kind of doing their thing. And you are creating a support circle for yourself. Um, can you craft a rally or some sort of mobilizing action that addresses an issue, kind of puts things into gear, something that just helps you channel the anxiety and the emotion in a positive way?
Absolutely. And I think, things like mindfulness has gotten a lot of buzz. It's a buzzword now, but a good buzzword. But I mean, even when we think about, when we tell someone, okay, take some deep breaths, right? If you're having a panic attack or something
Yes.
like that, it seems almost simplistic, but in thinking about, right,
Yeah.
neurologically, how that's helpful, and thinking about physiologically how our body is responding to stress, right?
Yeah.
Not necessarily like the eustress, like which we call like the good stress that helps us to get things done. But that distress. So when we're feeling
Yes.
distress, how do we translate that into something that is productive?
Mhm.
There's a term for a nerve that runs, the longest nerve that runs all the way through our body for the most part. It's called the vagus nerve. And it used to be called the pneumogastric nerve. But it runs all the way through our body and is connected with the parasympathetic nervous system, which basically calms you down, right? So
right.
our sympathetic nervous system is the flight or fight or freeze, and they added another F that I can't remember right now. Kind of like our response to stress, our response to fear, our response to, something external, really upsetting us, right? So we
Mhm.
have a physiological response. But then we have our parasympathetic nervous system, which calms us back down after our sympathetic nervous system has been aroused,
Mhm.
right? And the
Mhm.
vagus nerve is a huge part of that. But, right, so all of that said, all of, that science, but taking
Mhm.
deep breaths
Mhm.
are a part of getting us back to calm, getting us back to homeostasis. That, mindfulness exercises that might be 5 minutes, that might be
Mhm.
2 minutes,
Mhm.
can be helpful in a lot of ways.
And breath work is a huge, particularly because when you think about it, one of the things that we do hone in on physiologically is when we are really driving hard into that stress response, our breath gets more and more shallow. And so, we're just not taking in as much oxygen. We're not really allowing the body and the lungs to expand. And, the reason for that was, right, if taking that evolutionistic idea and model is, you kind of, all your energy and all your power, right, really went into, okay, let's face the danger,
Yeah.
take it on. And what if I'm going to fight, if I'm going to freeze, if I'm going to hide, if I'm going to run? I just need the power to do the thing to get out of the danger.
Absolutely.
But when we can kind of turn that down, right? And I always like to give my my students and persons that I'm working with this idea of a dial. So don't think of it as you're attempting to, like a light switch. Oh, I'm anxious, flick it off.
Yeah.
Where's the off? Where's the off? Right? No. It's a dial. Turn it down, turn it down, and just keep turning it down, keep turning it down. Because even if I'm on 20, if I can get to 10 or 8, I'm doing a lot better. But if I'm looking for off, I still may re-energize the anxious response, right? Because it's not off.
And then that vacillation might be stress inducing.
The vacillation becomes stress inducing. Yeah. So love the breath work.
Yes.
So parents, I think all in all, we're saying, remember to take care of yourself. Remember to take those pauses, 2 minutes, a larger chunk if you can. and know that you can show up even in these super stressful moments, super stressful times
Yeah.
for your children. And with that, we did want to take a moment just to offer a prayerful thought, a prayerful intent of loving kindness to the people, the parents, the families, the employees, all in Uvalde, all involved in the everyone that it touched, everyone that was impacted. Our hearts, our prayers, and our loving kindness intentions just really pour out to them, and hope that it adds a little measure to fill their cup
Yeah.
that has been emptied in this terrible tragedy. Parents of Stuart, we leave you again. We appreciate you and so have so enjoyed speaking with you today.
Thank you for having us.